Hi, I'm Steve Morgan, and in this video I want to move on from the recent discussion of intuition and risk decision making and develop that a bit further by reflecting on some of the work by Professor Daniel Kahneman. He's a psychologist who is attributed as perhaps giving some of the most revolutionary thinking and work to how we go about making decisions. Over a number of decades, he worked with his late partner Amos Tversky, but it was around about 2003, I think, that Daniel Kahneman was given the Nobel Prize for Economics. He's a psychologist by background, because of the nature of this work and the influence it was having on financial decisions. Now, clearly, I want to focus more on health and social care, not so much on finance decisions, but the whole basis of this work by Kahneman is presented both in his books, 2011 and updated in 2012, Thinking Fast and Slow, but it's also nicely reviewed in a documentary in the BBC Two Horizon series back in 2014, How You Really Make Decisions. And I want to draw from some of the thoughts and the ideas that have been presented, both in the book but also from that documentary. One of the messages that comes out is that in any average day we make between 2,000 and 10,000 decisions. It's almost one every breath you take, but clearly the vast majority of those decisions are pretty simple, straightforward, don't require a great deal of conscious effort. But then again, there are also decisions that will demand much more mental agility, much more analytical thinking, perhaps much more collaboration with other people. If you think of yourselves as, let's say, for example, practitioners in health or social care, in any one day you might well be involved in making decisions about arrangements, rearrangements, responding to crises, making care plans, deciding where and when you're going to meet with a client, thinking about staff covering, team meetings, what your contribution might be, thinking about challenging staff members. There's a whole range of different decisions that we would be called on to make in any one day, and that's a short list. It could go on much longer. But again, I want to emphasise, and this goes back to that revolutionary work by Kahneman, there is two levels of thinking that will broadly influence the way we go about making those decisions. We like to generally believe that we are thoughtful, analytic people. And where the revolutionary work comes in is that Daniel Kahneman provides plenty of evidence to show that that's one of the two systems. But that's system two. We actually spend much more time in system one. And system one is much more of the, say, the fast, the emotional, the automatic, the effortless type of thinking. That's the intuitive thinking. And the vast majority of decisions that we've been making from, there you go, being based at home, I can have a prop of a cup of tea. Thinking about doing that, the actions that I need to eventually have a sip of my tea. There's already quite a number of decisions were made without me really giving a lot of effort to those. Now, to be sure that I get some of my quotes and material correct, I will refer, if you don't mind, to my manual, going back to 2013, Risk Decision Making, where I did capture a lot of this particular work. Now, again, I want to emphasise that Daniel Kahneman talks about these two systems. So if I quote them very specifically to you, System 1 operates automatically and quickly with little or no effort and no sense of voluntary control. This is akin to intuition or gut reaction, gut feeling. System 2 allocates attention to the effortful mental activities that demand it, including complex computations. And this is more akin to deeper analytical thinking. Now, in reality, we use both. They interact with each other, even though we probably use System 1, and Kahneman certainly says we use System 1 far more than System 2. But certainly in our role perhaps as practitioners making various decisions, we might well start off with an intuitive thought, but then the very nature of the work that we do and the decisions that involve people's lives should encourage us to then kick into System 2 and draw much more on that kind of slower, more deliberate, more logical, more rational, more analytical thinking to develop whatever that initial intuitive thought was. So these two will play in alongside each other. But the whole idea of intuition, let's go back to, in fact, a simple definition by Kahneman, if I get that right. It's intuition defined simply as knowing without knowing how you know. It's a nice way of putting it fairly simply. Knowing without knowing how you know. There is degrees of caution, as I've said in the previous video, that needs to be employed when we're using this intuitive side, the System 1. Gigerenzer reminds us that intuition, gut feeling, hunch, these can be very interchangeable, and that these will refer and be the basis for our judgments when we make those judgments very quickly without being fully aware of the underlying reasons for them. In fact, Gigerenzer goes on to say it is very important. It plays a cautious role because if we stop doing everything for which we do not know the reason or for which we cannot provide a justification, we would probably soon be dead. There's a pretty final view on the importance, the need of doing something that engages that intuitive level of thinking. Zweig, again, if I just check my previous writing, it also introduces that degree of caution by saying that intuition can yield wondrously fast and accurate judgments, but only under the right conditions, when the rules for reaching a good decision are simple and stable. Now, Zweig focused very much on financial decisions and talked about how intuition has a legitimate role, but it should be subordinate, not dominant. The best financial decisions draw on the dual strengths of your investing brain, which is intuition and analysis, feeling and thinking. So again, the significant message that comes across from the literature around thinking and decision making is the important role that intuition plays, but the great deal of caution that needs to be added. In fact, I'll finish off this particular part of what I want to get across to you by quoting Kahneman again, because I like this particular thought that he came up with. True experts know the limits of their knowledge. Many pseudo-experts have no idea that they do not know what they are doing. I like that one because, yes, I can think back over my career and bring into that category of pseudo-experts a number of people that maybe had an initial intuitive thought, but then developed such a strong belief without any rational reasoning behind it, and were not particularly open to explore that initial thought in any great depth. In fact, Kahneman reflects that by saying that they create an illusion of validity through holding high degrees of confidence in unfounded intuitions, because in the concept of what you see is all there is, they will ignore what they don't know. Ignore what they don't know. That leads us into other influences on decision making, the idea of biases. Cognitive bias or confirmation bias is an immediate one that comes to mind, and that's tying in with that message a moment ago, where we tend to be very good at coming to that initial thought and sifting out the evidence that backs up our initial thought. And in doing that sifting, we can also be very good at eliminating or marginalising any of that particular evidence that is emerging that would challenge that thought. So we do have this sometimes known as cognitive ease, but it's a cognitive bias or a confirmation bias that confirms what we already want to believe. There's an irrational element to that, certainly, and I suppose it's also backed up. I'm just looking at some of the literature. Ariely talks about the concept of relativity, where it's suggested that we not only tend to compare things with one another that may not be comparable, but we also avoid comparing things that are not easy to compare. So we'll be placing a degree of value on something that there is no real underpinning evidence for that degree of value. That's something that will consciously influence the way we make decisions. Emotional arousals are another one in that area. When we think about our shopping habits, in fact, marketers are very good at dressing things up, making them look smart, giving them smart names, and bumping up the price as a result. And how many of us fall into that trap when we're doing the daily or the weekly shop, where we're thinking about these buy one get one free offers, because we're tempted by the fact we're getting something for free, and we've not really, that's our intuition, our initial gut feeling, we're drawn by our gut to this free offer that's there, and we don't necessarily provide enough time to analyse that this is not a product that we need. In reality, if you adopt that slower, more rational way of thinking, you might well come to the conclusion that actually I can save an awful lot by not even buying the first one, let alone having something free that I may not be spend a lot of time using. So that emotional arousal, there's another bias there that we can easily fall into. A further, if we think about biases, a further one that comes up very frequently, certainly within the work I do with practitioners, with teams, working within organisations, is this idea of hindsight bias. We make a decision, something goes wrong, and then the process of inquiry, on the basis of hindsight, the blame culture will kick in. The problem with this is that we're all experts with the benefit of hindsight. But again, if I go back to look at some of the literature that Kahneman identifies around this, there's some important messages which do tie in quite significantly with the work that I've been developing around positive risk-taking. Kahneman identifies hindsight bias and suggests this has a pernicious effect on decision makers by shifting their attention away from the quality of the process onto the concerns for the possible outcomes. That's where that influence of the blame culture will particularly come to bear. Kahneman suggests that the potential influence of hindsight drives decision makers to bureaucratic solutions with a reluctance to take risks, with the aim of protecting clinicians more than benefiting patients. So the focus very much on protecting from the harm that the clinician could be at in the end, and that overrides the benefits for the patient. Implications are that there might well be some harms, at least the harm of not having the benefit for the patient themselves. He describes his concerns about the influence of hindsight bias thus. When an expected event occurs, we immediately adjust our view of the world to accommodate the surprise. A general limitation of the human mind is its imperfect ability to reconstruct past states of knowledge or beliefs that have changed. Once you adopt a new view of the world, or any part of it, you immediately lose much of your ability to recall what you used to believe before you changed your mind. So that's quite an important one, that when we make some of those big decisions in our practice, and then subsequently something goes wrong, not only are others, with the benefit of hindsight, becoming very critical of us, but we can fall into that trap of becoming challenged to put ourselves back in the position, to go back into history, go back pre the outcome, and put ourselves in that position where we can reflect back on what was available to us, what did we base that decision on, what was the information available. And this is very important when I come on to remind you about the work around positive risk-taking. This is a very important influence. So ultimately, Kahneman goes on to, in terms of reflecting this hindsight, it's seen to be especially unkind to decision makers who act as agents for others, such as health and social care practitioners. We are prone to blame decision makers for good decisions that worked out badly, and to give them little or too little credit for successful moves that appear obvious only after the fact. So there is not just this hindsight bias, there is also this impact of outcome bias, where we become far more concerned in evaluating decisions and beliefs based on what the potential outcome could be, rather than on the rational information that is available at the time. Now again, I want to emphasise the relationship of this work by Daniel Kahneman. He actually reminds us that we are more focused on preventing loss than we are on achieving gain. That was a very important message that came out in the Horizon BBC Two programme a few years back, where they demonstrated through a whole range of very practical and in some ways quite humorous exercises, but very serious exercises in terms of generating the evidence for how we are focused very much more on preventing loss than accelerating our gains. Now, where this comes into play for the work that I've been doing around positive risk taking is that I've very much looked to develop my own literature and a process and the tools that, let's say we start off with a intuitive feel for a risk that we should take or that we're going to support a client to take, but the tools are there to then kick in that system too, to think more about the slow, the deliberate, the rational, to bring more of that analytical process into play, so that the final decision is one that might well have started from system one, intuitive gut feeling level, but ultimately is very much based on the system two analytical level. Before I sign off, I just want to add a few other quotes around decision making, which I always find these quotes quite interesting, and I think they help to prompt the thinking a little bit. So here's 4 quotes that I just finished off. I want to finish off this video with. Scott Adams tells us that informed decision making comes from a long tradition of guessing and then blaming others for inadequate results. Bring a bit of humour into that, but I'm sure that plays out in some experiences that some of you have had. Dodinsky says that do not plant your dreams in the field of indecision where nothing ever grows but the weeds of what if. Don't be stuck in that perpetual situation of what if I had done such, what if I had decided that. Maimonides says that the risk of a wrong decision is preferable to the terror of indecision. Go for it, risk it, take the decision. Don't stay stuck in that period of indecision. And finally, one that is attributed here to Will Rogers, but I know Aneurin Bevan amongst others, Mark Twain, I think a few others have been credited this particular one. Even if you're on the right track, you'll get run over if you just sit there. So on that basis of not just sitting there, I'll sign off by reminding you, take risks for positive outcomes.